going on, college football fans? Jack here with another episode of the Big and Bold College Football Show. And of course, today's episode is talking about the recently released playoff poll that has been met with pretty mixed response. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen. It definitely clashes with the AP poll. And on today's episode, I'm going to show you both of those polls, at least the teams that I believe are playoff contenders. I'm going to show you the top 14 teams from each poll and show you the path that they can take to get to the playoff. Because I think when you get the top 14 for both polls, any of those teams can make it. It just varies in likelihood. I'm going to show you my top 10 and how I think the playoff should be looking if it was to happen today. We're going to talk about some of the gross issues with specifically the playoff poll right now and the problems I have with that. So we're going to jump into this episode. I have a few more edits on this episode than I usually do. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see a few of those transitions as you're watching. Now, of course, outside of just the teams competing for the playoff, there are some really strange issues with the playoff poll. The most obvious one has to be the exclusion of Penn State, in my opinion, especially when you consider Penn State has beat 21st ranked Wisconsin and 13th ranked Auburn. And yet Penn State is still outside of the playoff football rankings, behind teams like Pittsburgh, who's 6-2, doesn't have a win over a top 25 team, San Diego State and Fresno State, and the one that really has people upset is Mississippi State. Mississippi State is the 17th ranked team in the country, coming in at 5-3. Yes, they beat a 12th ranked Kentucky. That was an impressive win. They also got blown out by 40 to Alabama. They did beat A&M, but they lost to LSU. They lost to Memphis. I don't really understand how a team like Mississippi State is in over Penn State, especially teams like Pitt. I don't see why they're in over Penn State. So that's a gripe that I have. Personally, I think it has to do with the fact that they want to bolster Alabama's ranking. But we'll talk a little bit more about that looking at the teams competing for the playoff. Now, if you're looking at the screen, I have, again, those top 14 teams from each poll, specifically looking at the playoff poll. And I have some real issues. I'll talk really quickly about the AP poll. Why is Ohio State over Oregon? Now, that head-to-head is being reflected in the playoff poll, not the AP poll. I don't know how you put Ohio State a spot above Oregon when Oregon literally won that matchup in week 2. Why is Michigan State not in the top 4 of the AP poll? When Michigan State has a top 10 win, Oklahoma doesn't have that. Oklahoma has struggled in, I can count 4 or 5 different games. Michigan State struggled in 2. I don't understand how you have Michigan State behind Oklahoma. And one of my other issues here is what justifies Notre Dame being above Oklahoma State like they are. Oklahoma State has multiple wins over top 25 teams. I think they've played 3, beat 2. Notre Dame doesn't have that. Now, they did beat Wisconsin. Wisconsin is now in the top 25. Wisconsin also started off 1-3. So I don't think Notre Dame has any reason to be that far above Oklahoma State. But let's look at the playoff poll, which really matters, and then we're going to get into my top 10, and we're going to talk about the path moving forward for some of these teams competing for the playoff, because that's what this is really all about. Trying to make sense of why the AP poll and the playoff poll look the way they do, and what's the future going to be like for these teams. Now, first of all, my first main complaint is how was Alabama the number 2 team in the country? They don't have a top 10 win like Michigan State does over Michigan. They have that loss to an unranked team, mind you. And they struggled against Florida. They had a really bad half against Tennessee. I don't think Alabama's the number 2 team in the country. They have some legitimate wins. Both teams have beat Miami, for example. But how do you have Alabama over Michigan State? The only reason for that is, for one, SEC bias, which I think is very evident. And number 2, you're taking talent ratings heading into the year, which don't matter to me. That is one of the last things I utilize when ranking teams, is team talent. Because if that was the case, shouldn't Clemson be in the top 25? They have a few wins. Shouldn't LSU be in the top 25 because they have a few wins? It means very little to me. I will say I like Oregon at 4. They deserve to be over Ohio State in that final playoff spot. The question becomes, if both teams win out, does Oregon maintain that? Because then you're going to be drawing resumes. Who has the stronger resume? Obviously, Oregon has the win over Ohio State, but if Ohio State's played more ranked teams, they're going to make the argument. I don't like Cincinnati at 6. They're undefeated. No, they haven't played a great schedule, but they did beat Notre Dame, who is a top 10 team in the playoff poll. Not to mention they're 17-1 in their last 18 games. That one loss, 3-point loss to Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. And Georgia's the number 1 team in the country this year. They were a top team last year. Really feels disrespectful to Cincinnati. I feel like the committee simply said, we don't want to deal with Cincinnati in our top 4. We're just going to kick them out and let it figure itself out. If they lose a game, no sweat off our back. If they don't, we'll figure it out with the remaining teams here. Michigan at 7. I don't think that that's a reasonable ranking. I certainly don't think it makes sense to place them over Oklahoma, who is an undefeated team. Maybe Oklahoma's struggled, but they're a lot more talented than Michigan. And as I said, I don't think that matters all that much. But they're an undefeated team. Michigan hasn't beat a ranked team, and they have a loss. Granted, it was to a top 10 team. It was to Michigan State. So I don't think they should fall drastically, but they shouldn't be over Oklahoma. And I debate with myself if I think they should be over Wake Forest or maybe even Notre Dame. I don't know if I like Michigan that high. So I have several issues with this. I think you can kind of tell that money and projection for bowl games means a lot to the committee when ranking these teams. Because what they've done is they've said, even if Alabama loses another game, we're going to give them the opportunity to stay in the playoff if they beat Georgia. Again, that's sort of a scenario we'll talk about in a minute. Oregon, Ohio State, very smartly placed up next to each other because as soon as Oregon loses a game, Ohio State jumps right in there. Very smart. Screwing Cincinnati, putting them at 6. Even if they win out, this is indicative of the fact that they don't believe an undefeated Cincinnati deserves to be in the playoff, which I find ridiculous. But that's what the committee is saying to you, is that there are one-loss teams that we would rather see in the playoff over Cincinnati. Michigan, Notre Dame, 7th and 10th ranked team in the poll. They're trying their hardest to keep them in New Year's Six Bowl competition. They're well aware of the fact that Notre Dame could get upset to a random team. Michigan's probably going to lose to Ohio State and be a 10-2 team. They can throw those two out there, and they'd much rather have those teams in there in the New Year's Six Bowl conversation than Cincinnati or Wake Forest or Oklahoma State. Because to me, Oklahoma State deserves to be over Notre Dame, maybe over Michigan. I just don't like where the ranking has these teams. And then the really interesting thing here, Oklahoma State and Baylor, 11 and 12, Auburn, Texas A&M, 13 and 14. Those teams kind of are going to determine what their season looks like as well. And again, we'll talk about that now. So you can see what my top 10 looks like here. And yes, I know the number 1 next to Georgia is not in bold. Program I'm using wouldn't work, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But I have Georgia number 1, that's obvious. Michigan State number 2, they have a top 10 win. They're undefeated. I don't care what their team talent rating was heading into the year or what their projections were. I know that they're an undefeated team right now and deserve of number 2. Number 3, Cincinnati. Again, undefeated, 17-1 in their last 18 games. I like Cincinnati. They have a legitimate win over Notre Dame. They beat Indiana, who isn't a very good team this year, but it's a Big Ten team. You know, it's not like they're playing a ridiculous team every week. Number 4, Oklahoma. This is the one where I think I could upset some people, but it was hard for me to determine that 4th spot, and it's the one that's up for debate the most. Oklahoma is undefeated since they went from Spencer Rattler to Caleb Wilson at quarterback. The offense has been much more effective. It's really not been the defense that's a problem for them. It's really been the offense. In fact, their defense has saved them in some games. Oklahoma is a really good team, and I do like them at 4 as an undefeated. They could lose in a week. Any of these teams could lose in a week. But right now, I do like Oklahoma at 4 over the one-loss Alabama. But out of the one-loss teams I have, I do think Alabama is the best. They don't have the best win on their schedule. That goes to Oregon at 6 with their win over Ohio State, who I have at 7. If you wanted to shake those 3 teams up in any certain way, you can, but I don't think I want to put them in my top 4 just yet. 8, I have Wake Forest. No, they haven't played any good teams, but it's an ACC schedule. They're an undefeated team. I've got to have Wake Forest in my top 10. Number 9, I have Oklahoma State. They have a couple of top 25 wins, a competitive loss to a good, not great, Iowa State team. So I'm fine with Oklahoma State at 9. And at 10, I have Notre Dame. I put them over Michigan. Michigan, I would say, would be at 11 for me, even though I am a Wolverine fan. I like Notre Dame at 10. They haven't played a lot of great teams. They did play a ranked Wisconsin. They've struggled against some teams early on, Florida State, Toledo. But they've played legitimate programs, North Carolina, USC. Their one loss is to Cincinnati, and I think Cincinnati's a playoff team, so I'm not going to kill Notre Dame for that. So that is how my top 10 shakes out. Let me know how you guys feel about this, what your top 10 looks like. And like I said, in my mind, I don't really care about recruiting rankings. I don't really use talent as a definitive factor in my rankings. I use results. And the results for Michigan State, Cincinnati, in my opinion, have been above that of a few other teams. And there's not a set in stone criteria to make the playoff, which is why you can kind of make it whoever you want. What do you think the 4 best teams in college football are? And yeah, just because, let's say, Alabama is one of the best teams in college football, doesn't mean they deserve to be in it because your resume matters. So that's how my playoff looks. That's how my top 10 looks. Next up, let's compare the resumes of the undefeated teams in college football this year. Now, I don't have a couple teams on here. UTSA is one because I don't think they're a playoff contender. Wake Forest is the other because even if Wake Forest were to win out, I'm sorry, I don't think they're going to make it in to the playoff. And I don't think they're going to go undefeated anyway. But respect to Wake Forest and what they've done, these are the 4 undefeated teams with their associated playoff rankings right now in the poll. So you look at what each team has done, and this is me presenting you the schedules. This is me presenting you the information. Now, if you notice, these 4 teams are the teams I have in my top 10 and my top 4 in my playoff rankings. From 1 to 4, Georgia, Michigan State, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma. Because I value an undefeated record. I value wins over top 25 teams. Now, you could look to say the Miami win for Michigan State, and that win doesn't mean very much now. But take Cincinnati's win over 9th-ranked Notre Dame. Notre Dame is still a top 10 team. So I do value that over, say, talent ratings. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can see my predictions. I have Georgia going undefeated in the regular season. That was what I had them doing in the offseason. Missouri, Tennessee, Charleston Southern, Georgia Tech, not worried about any of those games. You never know in college football, but I really highly doubt that Georgia loses any of those games. Michigan State, 10-2, maybe I'm a player hater, I don't know. But at Purdue is a very sneaky game. Purdue has shown that they can beat really good teams, and they've shown they can lose to anyone. But between Ohio State, who I do think Michigan State loses to, and Penn State, it is entirely possible they could lose 2 games. In all likelihood, maybe they go 11-1. They're not going to go undefeated. But I'm going to call it 10-2. We'll see what happens by the end of the year. I do have them falling out of the playoff, though. But if it was today, I think Michigan State should be in. Cincinnati, I have them going 12-0. I think the thing for people is they bring up, well, what's Cincinnati's next best win on their record? And that would technically be if they end up beating SMU. But if you want to split hairs and you want to talk about, take your pick, say Oregon, who people think should be a playoff team. Outside of beating Ohio State, what's their next best win? Cincinnati, I think, is going to go 12-0, and I think if they go 12-0, the committee has to put them in at the 4th spot. Will they? I don't know, but I think they should. And then finally, we have Oklahoma. I think they're going to go 11-1. In all likelihood, they can still make the playoff because as long as they beat Baylor and Oklahoma State or Baylor and Iowa State, they're going to get a shot to win another game in the Big 12 championship game and solidify themselves as a one-loss playoff team. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if a one-loss Oklahoma made it in over an undefeated Cincinnati. So that is their resumes up to this point. That's how I think the year is going to go for those teams. And yeah, these are my top 4 teams if I was the lone decider on the playoff committee. Now we can jump over to one-loss teams and take a look at what kind of years they've had and what they're going to do moving forward. Now, I don't have Oklahoma State in here, but we're going to talk about them a little bit. Alabama, obviously, I think they're going to go 11-1 because LSU, kind of a dumpster fire this year. Arkansas is sneaky, but it's at home for Bama. Then at Auburn. Now, Auburn is a very difficult team this season. Brian Harsin's doing a great job there. But I still think Alabama wins that game. I think they go 11-1. And what's going to happen is they're going to meet up with Georgia in the SEC title game. If they're 11-1, drop to 11-2, does the committee try to put Alabama into the playoff? I believe it's the first two-loss team to be in the playoff. That will be interesting to see. Oregon, I think they go 10-2. They've already got one surprising loss to Stanford. I wouldn't be surprised if they got upset to Washington, Utah. We'll see. In all likelihood, yeah, they could go 11-1, but I do think they drop another surprise loss on their schedule. But they're deserved, I think, of being at the 4th spot in the country, even though they have an overtime loss to Stanford. Ohio State at 5, I think they go 11-1. I think that they have too good an offense to lose to the likes of Michigan State, Michigan, and in all likelihood, if they do win out, are we talking about Ohio State in the playoff? Michigan at 7, again, I think it's too high for the Wolverines. I think they beat Indiana by 30. I think they beat Penn State on the road. I think they beat Maryland on the road. And probably get embarrassed by Ohio State because Ohio State's going to utilize tempo. They're going to attack Michigan through the air. And I think Michigan goes 10-2 and has a fine 10-2. But when you lose to Michigan State and Ohio State, who really cares? And then finally, Notre Dame at number 10. I think they go 11-1. They could get upset by, say, a Stanford or Virginia. But ultimately, they're probably going to be an 11-1 team. I don't know if it's good enough for a playoff appearance. They've struggled against some teams. 10-point win against North Carolina. Beat Florida State by 3. Toledo by 3. Virginia Tech by 3. And quite honestly, if they don't think Cincinnati's a playoff team, then I think Notre Dame losing to Cincinnati really killed their playoff aspirations. And there's just going to be other one-loss teams that the committee's going to put above Notre Dame. And then, as I said, Oklahoma State. I do think Oklahoma State loses another game this year, but they are a very good team. Now, to wrap up the episode, the playoff poll has some legitimate issues. I think that money and projecting TV ratings and things along those lines, setting up bowl games, is really what matters to the committee, not legitimately who is the number 1 team and then move to the number 2 team and 3 team in the country. I don't think they do it that way. And I think it's a shame for the sport. I think that it really negatively affects college football. I think that there should be a more set-in-stone criteria for what makes you a playoff team, but we're not going to get it. It's just not going to happen. I think that's why people want to not only expand the playoff, but change the playoff format. Now, what scares people is the idea of a team winning, say, the ACC, and a far more talented or a team with a better record from the SEC not being ranked above that team or being in the playoff. And that may just be the risk that teams have to take, in my honest opinion. But with that, that's going to wrap up the episode, everybody. Like I said, I wanted to go over some of the issues I had with the playoff poll. Wanted to just mirror it up with the AP poll as well. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that they got it right? What do you think they got wrong? Do you like my top 10, specifically my 4 teams I think should be in the playoff? Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think I'm over or underestimating some of these teams that I decided to highlight? Because again, I wanted to see who do I really think can make the playoff. Based on my assessment of the situations that these teams are in, Notre Dame, maybe. Probably not Oklahoma State. Oregon, Ohio State, maybe. Alabama, maybe. Oklahoma has a really good shot. Cincinnati, I think, is kind of getting screwed. And I don't know if Michigan State, for all I know, Michigan State can compete. But it's going to take them beating Ohio State. And it's going to take Ohio State beating Michigan State. So there's still some huge games coming up this year. Thanks for listening, everybody. Please like and subscribe. That's all I ask. If you haven't already, my most viewed video so far in the short life of this channel, titled An Angry Michigan Fan Breaks Down the Disappointing Loss to Michigan State, it's on my channel. Go check that one out. It's got a lot more views than any video I've made up to this point, so I appreciate everybody listening to that if you did. Appreciate you guys checking out this video, and hopefully I'll see you guys around for my next.